Cáride, Fáilte. Welcome to this very special talk from Féile and Phobail in partnership with St Mary's University College and the Irish News. I'm delighted today that we're joined by Dr. Éamon Phoenix, a member of the Taoiseach's Special Advisory Group on Centenaries, to talk about the decade of Centenaries, a common history, common memory. Éamon?
Gwr mil ymwag gyda column agus sian sort of Magdalene ag Connaught mil ymwag ffado hyn Tommy Brodol of Ian Shaw ag yn Féile inniu ag can't shwi on decade of Centenaries. And of course, as we approach the final segment of the decade of Centenaries column, I think it's interesting to reflect really on what has been achieved so far, the pitfalls that we've approached really in the last sort of almost decade since we started this. I remember an event in a smoke-filled room in Belfast back about 2011. Group of people, historians, people from the community sector, museums, libraries, community relations, heritage lottery, Taoiseach's department, sitting down and wondering how really we could mark the key events of this decade. Lots of people will commemorate them, will rejoice in them in their own communities and their own organisations. But I think historians and kind of councils and others have to kind of strike a balance and ensure that there's objectivity in approaching this whole decade. And that's what we tried to do. So in many ways, the first thing we did was reflect on Mary McAleese's phrase that in Ireland we have a common history, but not a common memory. One man or woman's 1916 means the Easter Rising and the blood sacrifice of Pearson Connolly in Easter week. Another man or woman may reflect on the Battle of the Somme and the blood sacrifice of the flower of Ulster Protestant manhood, in July to November 1916, which is a huge thing, emotional thing in the Unionist community, Loyalist community, as 1916 is in the Republican community. So in many ways, we looked at all this, and the first thing we did was really produce a series of very simple principles from which we thought funded events, be they talks, dramas, exhibitions, should be based on. And we had this other golden rule that if you're going to fund an exhibition with public funding, it must be able to travel across that invisible barrier between one tradition and the other. So we talked about events must start from historical facts. We have to establish the facts. I know there's the issue of the many-sided nature of the truth, but historians and others should strive through the documents, through oral testimony, to kind of shed light on the truth behind these events. Secondly, to recognise the implications and consequences of what happened, be that the formation of the UVF in 1913, of the partition of Ireland in 1922. And thirdly, reflect different perspectives. Obviously, there's a Republican perspective, there's a Loyalist perspective, there are perspectives in between, doing all that. And also to try to use these events over the last near decade to kind of, if you like, deepen mutual understanding and understanding of the period. I think a lot has been achieved on that. I've spoken personally in every community across the province of Ulster, 9 counties, on all kinds of events, on the Easter Rising and Loyalist communities, on the Battle of the Somme and Nationalist communities. And I think we've tried to flag up a whole raft of historians and community activists and authors and playwrights like Philip Orr, for example, have tried to flag up how interesting this period is, how complicated it is, how interconnected it is, and how quirky it can be. You have the Protestant Republicans, key to kind of the background to 1916 in Ulster. You have the Catholic Unionists like Sir Dennis Henry, First Lord Chief Justice of Northern Ireland. And you have interesting figures who have been, if you like, recalled from obscurity by the kind of spotlight of historical research and kind of public history during this decade. So I think that has all been quite marvellous. And when we look back, of course, from the perspective of 2012, we think of the other events that were remembered not so well. in the 20th century. 1962, the Unionist government remembered the Ulster Covenant. It was an exclusively Unionist and Loyalist affair, with the gun runners of 1914 in the forefront, being interviewed for television and radio and all of that. So no nationalist involvement there at all. Then we come to 1966, the All-Ireland commemoration of the Rising, very much a Republican event, North and South parades and demonstrations and so on, just before the outbreak of the Troubles, the Civil Rights Movement in the 60s. And then I'm old enough to remember Ulster 71. The slogan was, Ulster 71, come and join in the fun, except internment was happening as this great exhibition opened in the Botanic Gardens. And again, it was a celebration of Unionist achievement, of Carson's alleged achievement of facilitating the partition of Ireland and the establishment of a Northern Ireland state, something he would have denied, and perhaps we'll come back to that in the course of this discussion. So in many events, in many ways, we're reflecting on all of this. And when I reflect really on the decade, I always think of my great friend, Jimmy Kelly, James Kelly, born in Cavendish Street in 1911, the son of an RIC man from County Kilkenny. Remember, this was an all-Ireland regime down to 1921. Teachers were trained in Dublin, the police were trained in Dublin, they covered the 32 counties in terms of the Royal Irish Constabulary. There was an all-Ireland court system. People went up to Dublin, which was not only the capital of Ireland, but was the second city of the British Empire. There's probably much more until the period of Home Rule, 1912-14. There was even a Unionist sense of Irish identity, which becomes occluded after that, after the Ulster Covenant and the quest for self-determination outside an Irish state. Irish nationalists, on the other hand, the vast majority of them, something like 95%, were seeking home rule by constitutional means and looking to the Irish Party, the Irish Parliamentary Party of John Redmond, and in the north, wee Joe Devlin, who was born in the Falls Road of working class stock and who cemented together the rural and urban nationalists of Ulster, that small Catholic middle class based on the pavocracy, with the rest in the struggle for home rule, and delivered a bare majority of Ulster seats for the home rule cause down to 1916. That's the kind of background that we're dealing with there in a way. When I think of Jimmy Kelly, I think of what he told me, and he only died in 1911, aged 101, sharp to the end. And Jimmy recalled his father taking him to the window of Springfield Road RIC station on a late summer's, early autumn's night in 1914. And he brought the child, who was approaching 4, to the window and said, Jimmy looked out and he saw these incandescent fires burning on Black Mountain and Divis. And he said, Jimmy, you'll always remember this night. Ireland has just got home rule. This was the placing of the third Home Rule Bill on the statute book for all Ireland by Herbert Asquith, the Liberal Prime Minister. But of course that was to prove a mirage, a chimera, because of course it was deferred until the end of the war and the dark shadow of partition was already cast across the Irish political stage at that time. And then Jimmy recalled his mother wheeling him into town on a day when he saw a procession heading down the Falls Road. He was very young, had to be about 3, it was 1914, and it was the early months of the Great War. And these were men from the Falls and Ardoyne who had joined the Connaught Rangers, members of Redmond's National Volunteers. They had been urged by Joe Devlin and John Redmond to go wherever the firing line extended. And here they were, marching down the Falls Road, serenaded by the Irish war pipers of the Clan O'Low Pipers Band, going to take the train from the old GNR railway station in Great Victoria Street for Fermoy in County Cork, to be trained for their final journey to the Western Front, or perhaps the Dardanelles. And he remembered that. And he remembered the final march past of Carson's army, the Ulster Volunteers, now recast as the 36th Ulster Division on a sort of a summer's day in 1915. We have photographs of that. Carson's army marching past the review stand. There stands Carson, Craig, Lord Londonderry, watching these men going by ship to England and then to France, where many of them will be decimated in their blood sacrifice at the Battle of the Somme in 1916. And his final memory, He always talked about going south on a family holiday. His detective sergeant father going back to Kilkenny, taking the train via Dublin, having a few hours in the capital and seeing the smouldering ruins of stately Sackville Street, now O'Connell Street, in the wake of the Easter Rising. He always remembers the ruins. People were still standing and gawking at what was to be seen. Soldiers were still about. There were rumours of court-martials, echoes of dawn firing squads. And he remembered a huddled conversation by his parents in the farmhouse afterwards in Kilkenny. And they were whispering not just about the death of a near neighbour on the Falls Road. They were now living on Almeida Terrace, just above the Culture Land on the Falls Road, which was then Broadway Presbyterian Church. But he remembered them talking about the execution of their neighbour, James Connolly, the trade union leader who lived in a terrace house opposite the city cemetery. And Jimmy would remember his parents telling him about the sad procession of the widow, Mrs. Connolly, and her children, her daughters involved in Common them on during the Rising a few months later from Belfast. Their father and husband executed, making their way back to Dublin, totally distraught and poverty-stricken. So he gave me a great insight, and of course he would see the whole tapestry of turmoil, as he used to put it, unfold, from the Rising to the Belfast sectarian violence of the 1920s, flying flat dead on the Belfast trams as the infil-aided sniper fire between the Falls and the Shankill, a peace line appearing even then in the black days of 1922. And of course he would cover the news, the Northern Ireland Parliament, first in Botanic Avenue, then at Stormont. He would see the 1935 riots, the Second World War, the Troubles, and of course would celebrate the Good Friday Agreement and the new dispensation in 1998, which followed the ceasefires. So we have a great sense there, just from that one man who was brought up on the Falls Road and became the doyen of Irish political journalism, of the events of those kind of years as we reflect on them. And of course, Jimmy always recalled that just around the corner from his family home in Almeida Terrace was, of course, Celtic Park, Belfast Celtic's football ground. And it was to that ground on a dark, wet February day in 1912 that Winston Spencer Churchill came. He was First Lord of the Admiralty. He was invited by Lord Perry, the leading Ulster Liberal Home Ruler, but the managing director of the shipyards, where he was at daggers drawn with the 30,000 loyalist workmen who hated Home Rule, yet their managing director was an ardent Home Ruler. And he introduced Churchill and John Redmond and Joe Devlin to the assembled throng. And an interesting thing, Churchill had to turn around his father's famous injunction to the serried ranks of Ulster Unionists in 1886, Ulster will fight and Ulster will be right. He gave them their watchword. He cemented that alliance between the British Tory establishment and the British aristocracy and Ulster Unionism. That was to endure for a very long time and was to pay dividends to Carson and Craig in the struggle against Home Rule and indeed in the achievement of partition. But he remembered Churchill also congratulating the people of the Falls Road on the fine array of Union Jacks he had just passed under from his luncheon in the Grand Central Hotel, where he had met a baying mob of angry shipyard workers who were singing Rule Britannia, but he was wrong to think this was in honour of his post as First Lord of the Admiralty. And that tells us something else, that the Falls Road was ardently pro-Redmond, Devlinite, right through this whole period. Éamon de Valera would be defeated in the safe Catholic Belfast Falls seat in 1918 by a majority of nearly 3-1 by Joe Devlin, the darling of the mill girls, the coming man of this Home Rule decade. The ageing Redmond and John Dillon believed that after a year or two, Joe Devlin would be Prime Minister of an undivided Home Rule Ireland. So he had a vast talent. He also had a sharp native intellect. He was one of the finest orators of the age. He used to joke in the House of Commons, wee Joe Devlin, a small man with a mane of dark hair and a throbbing accent of his native city. He told his Unionist opponents, when I get up to speak, my enemies rush in. When you get up, he said, your friends rush out. And this was Joe Devlin, a man who, when he won West Belfast for the first time In 1906, he won by 16 votes. And the story goes that two old ladies were leaving the Crumlin Road courthouse, where Devlin's victory was announced. He had won the West after years of Unionist ascendancy. And Maggie said to Minnie, when you love to be in one of them 16 voters. And she says, sure, Maggie, I was all 16. That was the story. And Devlin seemed to be on his way. But of course, dark shadows were coming for the Nationalists. And Unionism, of course, was preparing to oppose the Asquith Home Rule Bill by force if necessary. The key thing, I think, was the election of Edward Carson as Irish Unionist leader, which really meant Northern Unionist leader in 1910. And here was Carson, the quintessential Irish Unionist, the Southerner who embraced the North, but of course was the prophet from another place. He was the lawyer with the Dublin accent. He was the man whose mother was sprung from the Cromwellian landed gentry of the west of Ireland, with a big house in County Galway, where Carson holidays. He heard Irish spoken in the fields. He saw the people, Agummuch playing hurley, a game which, of course, he would play a similar game in Trinity College, close to Shinty. And this was Carson, from the very beginning, of course, as a Unionist MP for his old University of Trinity College. This eminent advocate would say, the Union is my guiding star. You must remember that one. And of course, nonetheless, he wanted to maintain the whole of Ireland in the falls of the Union Jack. But in the end, having signed the covenant with 500,000 Ulster Protestant men and women, saying that they would use all means which are necessary, not ruling out force, to oppose an Irish Parliament in Dublin, despite the King in Parliament giving his fiat to the Third Home Rule Bill in 1914. But of course, he would in the end be forced to get the best deal for his Ulster Unionist clients. Not 32 counties in the end, not even 9-county Ulster, but 6 counties. In many ways, I often say, the tombstone to Edward Carson, the Dublin lawyer, outside Parliament buildings at Stormont, is not so much a monument to his political success, but a tombstone to his political failure. Because in the end, he was to desert what he called my own people. The scattered Unionists of Dublin and Galway, his father's people, the Dublin middle classes, his mother's people, the scattered landed gentry, whose interests he had always defended in Parliament and in the courts. And in the end, he would look back in anger. And when the treaty was signed, giving Southern Ireland virtual independence as a dominion in 1922, Carson turned on his friends, Bonar Law and Birkenhead, with whom he had stood on UVF platforms, and said, what a fool I was. I was only a puppet, and so was Ulster, and so was Ireland, in the game that was to bring the Conservative Party back to power. There was a bitterness there. He actually said to a judicial colleague, one of his fellow law lords in the early 1920s, as Ireland was engulfed in civil war, he said, I wonder was I right in 1886 not to go with the grand old man, Mr. Gladstone, because Carson had started off as a liberal, but had abandoned Gladstone when the old man had embraced Home Rule. Interesting last words for this great Unionist titanic force. And nonetheless, of course, it was in these early Edwardian years that the background and the framework and the undergirding of the Easter Rising was planned, not in Dublin, where the IRB was weak, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, but in Belfast, the most Unionist, the most Protestant, the most industrialised city in Ireland, just as James Craig, Carson's deputy, and the man who envisioned a homeland for his own people, the Ulster Protestants, in the event of home, just as he was setting up the more particularist Ulster Unionist Council in the Ulster Hall. A group of young men, vital young men in their early 20s, were setting up a new Irish Republican Brotherhood organisation. Men like Dennis McCullough, whose father was a publican on the Falls Road. Men like Bulmer Hobson, a Quaker, birthright Quaker, whose family came from County Tyrone, but who lived in the Holy Land in Belfast, a storied area to this day. Men like John Ernest, better known as Sean Lester, a journalist from Carrickfergus, a Methodist. Ernest Blythe, Armand de Bly, the man from Maharagal, from a Unionist Orange farming background, who had joined the Gaelic League, the Irish Volunteers, become a minister of the First Dáil, become Deputy Prime Minister of the Irish Free State, seeing the Irish language as a kind of a sort of interlink between the two traditions in Ireland to his dying day in the 1970s. It was this group of young men who brought on board a young Belfast tram conductor called Sean McDermott, who'd arrived in the town via Glasgow from County Leitrim. And he was a very charismatic young man. He would become a key figure with Hobson in Tom Clarke's inner circle in Dublin in the years after 1908, when the old Tyrone domiciled American Fenian returned to Ireland. And Clarke wanted to see an insurrection before he died. So they're beginning to wind the clock in Dublin after this Belfast renaissance in the Edwardian years. No one you would miss the background to 1916 if you missed the hands of Ulster, that were very much on the revolutionary tiller. But think of what happens in the north. Carson's resistance to Home Rule, not just the Covenant, which was a constitutional act, but contained a latent threat, but the Larne gun running, bringing in 35,000 German rifles, backed by the Curragh Mutiny, the British establishment, Field Marshal Sir Henry Wilson, soon to be Chief of the Imperial General Staff, another Southern Irish Unionist. And suddenly, of course, you have something else. Carson had reignited the Fenian flame. You must remember that one, as Michael Laffan wrote 30 years ago, because in his, of course, revolutionary gestures against Home Rule, Carson had lit the blue touch paper for an Irish revolution. Let's look at what Bulmer Hobson, the Belfast Quaker, said in relation to these events. He said that in 1914, Ulster had opened a revolutionary door, which we in the IRB must keep ajar. Ulster was the key to revolution. Suddenly the UVF had called into existence a second armed force, twice the size, this time 180,000 men, the Irish Volunteers. And in steps Owen MacNeill, an old boy of St. Malachy's College, a cultural nationalist, an historian from the Glens of Antrim. And of course, MacNeill was the first person to see the revolutionary potential from an Irish separatist viewpoint of Carson's army, because he wrote the famous article in November 1913 in the Gaelic League Journal on Clive Sullish, The North Began, quoting the Church of Ireland nationalist poet Thomas Davis, 80 years before, when Davis had written about the United Irishmen of the 1790s. The North began, the North held on, God bless the Northern land. And MacNeill actually believed that Carson's army had taken the most important gesture towards Irish national independence since the men of 1798. At a meeting in Cork to form the Irish Volunteers afterwards, he actually called for 3 cheers for Carson, which was greeted in Cork Town Hall, literally with 3 chairs thrown at the platform. He had to be rescued by another convert to Irish nationalism, the humanitarian Sir Roger Casement on that occasion. But the Irish Volunteers spread throughout the country. They are determined to defend Ireland's rights, as the UVF are determined to defy Home Rule. And of course, Ireland by 1914 is on the brink of civil war. Despite their numbers, their leverage with the Liberals in the House of Commons, the Liberals are now asking for a compromise. County option, perhaps temporary exclusion of Ulster counties, and of course by 1916, Redmond and Devlin have accepted at a meeting in St Mary's Hall the exclusion of the present 6 counties from Home Rule. The Nationalists argue this is only temporary until the end of the war, when it will be reviewed, and anyway there will be no Orange Parliament in Belfast, a key safeguard for Northern Nationalists, whereas Carson has a written guarantee from Lord George saying that, of course, partition would be permanent and enduring. Now, of course, what changes everything, what deflects Ireland from a path towards civil war, what eulogises the Ulster Volunteers, what marginalises John Redmond, is the titanic struggle that's about to open in Europe and engulf these islands, the Great War of 1914. Because on the eve of the Great War, you had that final attempt to resolve the question peacefully, the Buckingham Palace Conference. Churchill, who was there, said it soon became bogged down in the muddy byways of Fermanagh and Tyrone. These two Ulster rural counties became, it seemed, the key to the Irish question. They had small nationalist majorities. But the real key, looking back, was Belfast, with its large Protestant working class population, with its major industries, shipbuilding, engineering, linen. That would be the key to the Irish question, and that would enable, of course, Protestant Ulster to opt out of an Irish state, bringing these industries intact and maintaining that great free trade area, access to the British Empire, from Canada to India, for Belfast ships and Belfast linen, all of that going on. But of course the war would see the Irish volunteers and the Ulster volunteers march off to the battlefields of Europe. I always think it's very poignant to read this account. One of the main kind of projects in the last 10 years has been the Connaught Rangers project. On the Falls Road, where a group of people, some of whom had ancestors killed in the Great War, local historians like Jimmy McDermott, sat round a table and started to do research on the nationalist contribution to the Great War. We have to remember, of course, that Irish nationalist contribution to the Somme, to Messines, to the Dardanelles, north and south, was airbrushed out of history after 1921. One Irish cabinet minister of the day, Kevin O'Higgins, said that to commemorate Irish involvement in the Great War would be to give a wrong twist to the new Irish independent state. So they were forgotten. And in Northern Ireland, as it became, what was remembered was the sacrifice of the Protestant manhood of the Ulster Volunteers. And the Somme veterans and the Messines veterans and the Falls and the markets and elsewhere were more or less forgotten. So this project tried to remember them. But it actually turned up this report from the Belfast Evening Telegraph of November 1914, which talks about the muster of 500 men of the Belfast Regiment of the Irish National Volunteers who had enlisted in Lord Kitchener's army. And they left this forenoon bound for Fermoy, County Cork, to undergo training for the Western Front. It says the contingent left Victoria Barracks. There was a huge concourse of people cheering them on, and the rigidity of military discipline was relaxed to the extent of admitting the nationalist bands which came to play in Clifton Street, the recruits to the station and the barracks. There was no lack of musical accompaniment to the parade preliminaries. Kilted pipers in picturesque Gaelic costume, with their bright-hued banners, lent a touch of colour to the scene. So, this is amazing. The Clonolo War Pipers Band leading these nationalist volunteers, just as the Orange Bands serenaded the men of the Ulster Division to training at Clandeboy or County Donegal, Finner Camp, and then, of course, off to the Western Front, where they would face mayhem and, indeed, in many cases, extermination before the German machine guns in the Great War. But the Great War changes everything, and it creates the potential for an Irish insurrection. A military council is formed in Dublin, including men, like Sean McDermott, trained in Belfast. And of course, a key figure is Dennis McCullough from the Falls Road, a man who had a musical warehouse in Howard Street in Belfast, producing the war pipes that were seen as, a traditional Irish instrument of the day. And of course, he was actually the leader of the Irish Republican Brotherhood when the 1916 Rising was being planned. Planned as an all-Ireland revolt, it would eventually be narrowed to Dublin. And there, of course, we would have Sean McDermott's words played out, "We'll hold Dublin for a week and save Ireland." We know what he meant. It would be a blood sacrifice preeminently. And of course, it was the court-martial and the execution of Pierce Connolly, who was based in Belfast, McDermott and the rest, which of course created, that great wave of sympathy, which within weeks was to transform the situation. Lady Fingal, an Anglo-Irish aristocrat in her castle in County Meath, entertaining the British military who chaired the court-martial of Pierce and Connolly, could write in her diary, about the executions. Before those dawn firing squads, before a perfunctory court-martial, it was like watching blood flowing from under a closed door. We get a sense of the impact, also from the RIC reports, of how this transforms attitudes in Ulster and even in West Belfast after the situation occurs. And we have this remarkable diary that turned up in a bank deposit box about 20 years ago. The diary of a Belfast Unionist schoolteacher who witnessed the Easter Rising from the barricaded precincts of the Gresham Hotel, diagonally across O'Connell Street from the GPO. Now, James Mitchell from the Mount in East Belfast, who had signed the covenant, was aged about 38, had gone to Dublin with his brother on Easter Saturday 1916 to join the British Army. He kept being knocked back because of his advanced age. He was middle-aged at 38, unlike yourself. And the result was that he was obviously keen to show his credentials. Now, they chose a bad day, Easter weekend, 1916, to go to Dublin to join the British Army. They attended a play in the Theatre Royal in Dublin. They went to Portobello Barracks. They took the King's shilling. They were told they were soldiers, but don't come back to the end of the week. It was beautiful weather. They went to Ferry House races and returned to a transformed Dublin. Men in strange green uniforms in the GPO, a crowd, really a mob, looting Cleary's department store. And his diary tells us the whole story. He tells us, for example, anxious to assess the situation, I slipped out on the street to discover some ghastly sights. His diary records 2 horses lay dead opposite the Hammond Hotel in O'Connell Street, their soldier riders having been shot dead. And he sees, of course, the bombardment of the GPO as Easter week continues, and he sees eventually the surrender of the rebel forces under Pearson Connolly being marched off to court-martial. He manages to retrieve a friend's car from the barricades which Countess Markievicz had erected in St. Stephen's Green, making it back to the Mount. And he writes finally in his diary, all our experiences seem now to be those of a dream. Everything that had passed within the past 12 days has the impression of unreality. He failed to come back for his diary, which lay in a bank deposit box until the early 1990s. Was he killed in the Great War in which he was determined to enlist? Well, we'll have to wait for the next thrilling instalment. But nonetheless, we get a sense of even a Unionist view of the Easter Rising. And therefore, as I brought the diary of James Mitchell to Unionist and Loyalist communities, people said, when did this happen? Well, actually, it was during an event called the Easter Rising. Or when you came to the Covenant of 1912-14. And of course, there were 2 covenants in 1912. We think of the covenant signed by Craig and Carson and tens of thousands of others. But there was also the pro-Home Rule Covenant, signed by people like the Reverend J.B. Armour of Ballymoney, signed by Sir Roger Casement, Captain Jack White, a British officer from Brishain who had formed the Irish Citizen Army to defend the Dublin workers. And of course they write, we undersigned, Ulster Protestant men and women over the age of 16 years hereby repudiate the claim of Sir Edward Carson to represent the united Protestant opinion of Ulster, reject the doctrine of armed resistance to Parliament, and declare our abhorrence of the attempt to revive ancient bigotries and dying habits in this province. This almost forgotten covenant, which didn't get the same prominence, resonates with people when I go to the 3 lost counties, Cavan, Monaghan and Donegal, and you meet people whose forebears signed Carson's covenant. And they actually say, well, actually this document, rings like a document that speaks to us today as a document for our own time, of an island moving forward and seeking harmony and mutual understanding. And a new Ireland, perhaps today. You've got all of that. So we think about 1916, which changes everything, the rise of Sinn Féin, aware of the contradictions in West Belfast and East Ulster generally. Hibernianism, which was the marching wing of the Home Rule Party under Joe Devlin, has a major presence on the Falls Road, in East Tyrone, in South Armagh, and Sinn Féin loses by-elections in Ulster too in 1918 because of the continued popularity of, the Home Rule Party, even though Sinn Féin is making inroads, particularly west of the Bann. We think of the conscription crisis of 1918, when indeed the ranks of the Catholic population in Ireland, in conjunction with the Catholic bishops, sign a pledge, opposing conscription by all means in their power. And of course that radicalises the whole situation. The threat by Lord George to impose conscription during the war is not actually fulfilled, but it radicalises a whole generation of young nationalists, north and south, and reinforces the Sinn Féin message. In 1918, of course, Sinn Féin sweep the polls, and Arthur Griffith's Dáil Éireann is born in the wake of the election. An election which sees, of course, Joe Devlin defeat De Valera in the west, a very violent campaign on the Falls Road. It sees a young Winifred Carney, James Connolly's loyal secretary, the typist with a Webley in the GPO, standing, perfunctorily, I suppose, in the East Belfast seat of Victoria, getting about 400 votes, but standing not just on a Republican platform, but on a workers' Republican platform. She insisted on that to the top brass of Sinn Féin. And then, of course, we have, Edward Carson, migrating from his Dublin bailiwick of Trinity College to what the Provost of Trinity, Dr. Mahaffey, called a slum constituency in Belfast. Carson was a fish out of water in the hurly-burly of North Belfast, on the brink of the engineering strike of 1918, hiring Mount Vernon, a big house on the Shore Road, for a couple of weeks, and then returning to his South of England base. He wasn't really at home in a Belfast constituency. He was reaching the end of his days. And then, of course, as the War of Independence breaks out, it extends northwards. Part of the research of recent years has turned up the witness statements of the Northern IRA. We discover so much more every day. Since the lockdown, Michael Collins's plans for the burning of central Belfast in retaliation for the burning of Cork in 1920, called off at the last minute because a volunteer revealed it to a priest in confession who told the authorities and his bishop. Collins eventually calls it off. It could have been the match to light a major sectarian pogrom in Unionist Belfast in 1920. As it was, the violence that occurs is serious enough. The expulsion of Catholics from their workplaces in June 1920, inspired partly by Carson's rhetoric at the 12th Féile, partly by the IRA assassination of Lieutenant Colonel Gerald Smith of Banbridge, the senior police officer in Cork, who was targeted by Collins for making a very provocative speech, calling on the police to shoot down civilians in the battle against the IRA. So all of this is mounting. James Craig, of course, was a junior minister. His Ulster Unionist Party had the ear of the coalition government, which was dominated by the Tories, but headed by the Liberal Lord George. Lord George said he had murder by the throat. He poured in blackened hands and auxiliaries, and Craig managed to convince the British government to arm the UVF, returning from the trenches as the Ulster Special Constabulary in 1920. But of course, the Times of London said civil war would hardly be avoided with this sectarian force pitted against the Catholic minority in northeast Ulster. Nonetheless, without the specials, Craig was very astute. He was a junior minister. Without the specials, the borders of the new state could not have been created in South Armagh or the Bogside in the heady days of 1920 and 1922. The specials, 32,000 strong, are key to all of that. Of course, the IRA are much weaker. They have a campaign in the north attacking police barracks, political assassination. Collins even has a spy in Craig's military advisor's office in Musgrave Street, a man, an ex-soldier from the Falls Road, who is the personal secretary of Colonel Solly Flood. He's eventually outed, but takes about 20 files with him to Dublin as he flees his Belfast digs in August 1922. Very embarrassing for the authorities. Then the treaty is signed. No, the Nationalists are not happy with the treaty, because the treaty, how could victory, they say, hide such bitter fruit? The recognition of partition and, of course, a kind of a vague boundary commission to redraw the border. But Collins, of course, who wins the treaty debate narrowly against De Valera, he manages to get the bulk of the Northern IRA on side, just as the UVF are enrolling full scale in the Special Constabulary. And he plays a twin-track policy in the north in 1922. Collins' ambiguous northern policy. On the one hand, he seeks negotiation with Craig, the Craig-Collins Pacts, which failed to deliver peace or police reform, which were their aims, or get a single Catholic back employed in the shipyard and the engineering mills. On the other hand, of course, he uses coercion as well. He arms the Northern IRA, especially in border areas. He creates the Belfast City Guard. And of course, Owen MacNeill and Collins advocate a policy of non-recognition by Northern nationalists against the state. For example, the bulk of Catholic school teachers and schools are funded from Dublin via a secret service fund in 1922. Of course, abstention by the Nationalists and Sinn Féin from the new Northern Ireland Parliament mean that Craig establishes his cabinet, has control of policing, home affairs, introduces internment, the Special Powers Act, and there is no input from the nationalist minority, as the kind of framework of the state is laid down in the early 20s. Proportional representation is abolished. Gerrymandering of constituencies developed. Catholic schools are denied funding. Nationalists feel, of course, that they're undergoing a pogrom organised from the very top of the Unionist establishment. Unionists feel that they're under siege by the IRA in the south, massing on their border. And when peace finally comes in 1923, it's a very uneasy peace for a divided society. And it's with these kind of complicated events, in all their complexity, interacting on each other, that we, regardless of our political preferences, and particularly we historians and students of history, have had to deal over the last 7 or 8 years of this ongoing decade of centenaries.
Well, Éamon, thank you very much. That was a very informative talk, as always. Really wonderful. And if I could ask you, first of all, as we sit here in July 2020, against the backdrop in international news of the debate around statues, here in Belfast, at Stormont and at Belfast City Hall, some would contend that they reflect merely one of the two traditions, really. And in that international context, that's given a sort of an added impetus, I suppose, that question of the idea of inclusion and including visual representations of both traditions. So I was just wondering if you have any thoughts about where we are as a society in that regard.
Well, of course, the statuary of Belfast, whether in the city or in public places, reflects very much the Unionist, orange, British militaristic history of the Protestant community in Ulster, really, from, the plantation onwards. And it's been very slow to be transformed by the changing political process and changing demographics as well. Because I remember 20 years ago sitting on a committee in the City Hall, which was looking at balancing symbols as the political geography of Belfast was changing in the 1990s. And of course, we now have a statue of Mary Ann McCracken. There was talk of a Joe Devlin room, and so on. So there has been an attempt. At Stormont, of course, we have the matching of the portraits of Ian Paisley and Seamus Mallon, both involved, of course, in the executive over the last 20 years at different phases. And indeed, I was approached last year by, a very prominent Unionist member of the Assembly, who said to me, a number of icons of the old Stormont had been banished to stores. I mean, Craigavon in his Boer War uniform, portrait of Sir Henry Wilson, the table on which the Act of Union was allegedly drawn up, which had come out of an Ulster big house. And this person said to me, look, can we reach a situation where we bring all this back and balance it with a portrait of perhaps Joe Devlin, Michael Collins? And absolutely, my view was, as I looked over this stuff mouldering in a warehouse, we can't deny our history any more than we could deny the statue of Edward Colson in Bristol, have been a key figure but a slave trader in the area. We have to acknowledge that. The statue of John Mitchell in Newry. But of course, there is plenty of scope now for balancing these statues. And perhaps introducing a statue of Jemmy Hope the Weaver, a United Irishman, or a statue of, we have Mary Ann McCracken. She's become the ubiquitous cross-community feminist, of that radical era of the Enlightenment. But no doubt there's a lot more to be done in this. And I think it can be done by raising awareness of who some of these people were. I've often walked people from a very privileged background around central Belfast. And we've been talking about the sort of golden age of the 1780s and 90s when Presbyterians built the first Roman Catholic church since the Reformation in this city. And the parish priest said, this is a mark of regard, this Protestant friendship, which can never be effaced. We talk about the Belfast of McCracken and Tone and Samuel Wilson. And people have said to me, We never did this at school. I'm talking about people who are third level graduates and professionals, and they're saying we never did this at school. It was a kind of a hidden history, kind of a hidden curriculum. And I think we have to, make people aware that Belfast wasn't always a divided city, with recurring sectarian rioting. That is very much part of its past. It did have an industrial age, of course, but it was a key city in Ireland in bringing the kind of credo of the French Revolution to this island in the 1790s, and played a key role in the kind of imagining of an island of Catholic, Protestant and dissent. So maybe we have to return to that through education programs, public lectures, like the Féile is promoting.
And as the centenaries of the Civil War approach, I was wondering if you have any thoughts about how that might play out, particularly now that Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael are formally in coalition together in Dublin.
Actually, the big issue in the north is partition, about which opinion will be, interminably divided, clearly, In the south, it's the Irish Civil War. The party system, which took root in 1922, was based on the Civil War. It became Fianna Fáil versus Fine Gael. But of course, that's now occluded, not just in the new dispensation, but in the pandemic generation. There are bigger fish to fry than just national issues or nationalist issues. There are national issues of life and death at the present time. And it would be ironic if, for example, the changeover of the office of Taoiseach from Micheál Martin to Leo Varadkar or someone from Fine Gael coincided with perhaps a key point in the Civil War in 1922. I mean, there's an opportunity there. And I did read last week that Micheál Martin, on his inauguration as Taoiseach, really historic, with the votes of Fine Gael putting in a Fianna Fáil Taoiseach in a coalition government. You have to really ruminate on that, given the fact that for 40 years in Dáil Éireann, politicians who had been friends and comrades in the four glorious years after 1916 passed each other silently in the corridors and then attacked each other vigorously in the chamber because of the Cógal na Gaidge, the war of the friends. But it's interesting that Micheál Martin asked for the picture of Michael Collins, which had been removed by Varadkar when he left the Taoiseach's office 2 weeks ago, should be restored to hang alongside Éamon de Valera, two men who, having cooperated together during the independence struggle, were permanently estranged. Collins, a victim, of course, of the Civil War, and de Valera forfeiting the respect he was held by that pro-treaty tradition in what became independent Ireland.
I'm thinking, Éamon, of when Stormont, the institutions there fell 3 years ago, in January 2017. One of the factors that was cited by Martin McGuinness was a lack of reciprocation in terms of identity, and that has a relevance, of course, to the issue of centenaries, marking events that are foundational in the identities of people here. So I was wondering what you think the relevance of the decade of centenaries is to that question.
I think it's one of the things that the executive really passed up in the end, having appointed ministers 10 years ago to look at this. Nothing was actually being done, and arm's length bodies became involved. And actually it has worked very well with museums and libraries, community groups, the Féile, Shankill Women's Group, all kinds of people participating in this, in many ways. I mean, the number of groups that have gone to Dublin to visit Kilmainham and, Dublin Castle, a very British place, given its origins as the epicentre of English rule in Ireland. I mean, from the Loyalist community, it has been amazing in the last number of years. I've been involved in quite a lot of that. And people have been engaging. I mean, I think a lot of people now realise it's more complex. And there was trouble before 1969, is something a lot of people have discovered as well. And I think that's good. I think that in spite of the reticence of politicians or the refusal to engage, and we know that identity and mutual respect has become a burning issue and was addressed in the New Decade, New Approach documents this year with the Irish Language Act finally agreed and so on. I think that things have happened, though, that may surprise the public. I mean, one was last year in January, the outgoing Speaker of the Assembly, Robin Newton, had an event to mark the inauguration of Dáil Éireann in 1919, 100 years earlier. Members of the Oireachtas and MLAs attended. And I was privileged to give a talk on the foundation of the first Dáil, because it was a major event on this island, and it attracted not just Irish but international press interest, and a number of its members, like Ernest Blythe from Lisburn, Sean McEntee from Belfast, sentenced to death in 1916 but survived, and indeed Patrick McCartan from County Tyrone were members of the first Dáil, and had their roots in the north of Ireland. So, that was interesting in itself. And I think we're looking forward to events. For example, Belfast City Council are interested in promoting events, which also we in the Taoiseach's Advisory Group meeting in Dublin are very interested in, to mark, for example, the King's speech in the City Hall in June 1921, when the King not only inaugurated the Northern Parliament, but he actually called on Irishmen to stretch out the hand of friendship and reconciliation. And in the spirit of his words, of course, he offered an olive branch to De Valera and Collins in the south, which led to negotiations in the treaty. And then you have the Craig-Collins Pact of March 1922, following the barbaric MacMahon murders in Belfast, at the height of the Belfast Troubles, which actually was an attempt brokered by Churchill to bring Craig and Collins together. And they worked out the only attempt really to involve the Catholic minority in the running of the state. Obviously it failed. That ground wasn't revisited for another 50 years, but we're going to try to look back on those events, the might have beens, if you like, of Irish history in that period. And I think that nobody is offering any resistance to that from the establishment in either tradition, which is a good thing.
And in Dublin, particularly around the centenary of the 1916 Rising, there was a lot of talk about the vital issue of correcting the record in terms of the key involvement of women, and there was a lot of effort made to redress historical occlusions there and omissions. I just wonder, is there a sense that, as far as the government in Dublin is concerned, that there's still work to be done in terms of redressing the omission of the key importance that you've spoken about of the North in these events, and the seminal influence of events here in Belfast in these events?
Yes, I think we've reflected in our committee that the highest death rate in Ireland, the highest civilian death rate, was in County Antrim, which was effectively Belfast, between 1920 and 22, when nearly 500 people died violently in sustained sectarian and political violence, marking the birth pangs of the state. That was the greatest violence during the Irish War of Independence anywhere on this island. That's acknowledged. And I think there's a growing research being done into military archives, especially the archives of the Bureau of Military History and the military pension files, which have come on stream in the past couple of years, because there we can find the applications by many activists, but including women, for pensions, detailing what they did during the war. It's turned up all kinds of information. That in Belfast, doctor was one of the main providers of ammunition for Michael Collins in the south during the War of Independence. And much of that ammo was coming from the former Ulster Volunteers in Belfast, based in Carrickfergus Castle. It's a story you couldn't make up. The role of people like the Corps Sisters from the Ormeau Road, who were involved in Common the Mall, the story of James Connolly's daughters in 1916. Winifred Carney, who moves from being a women activist during the Rising, a trade unionist, to becoming a socialist within the confines of the new Northern Ireland state after 1922, marrying George MacBride, a former UVF man who had fought at the Battle of the Somme. And it was, again, a story you couldn't make up. And they're both active in the cause of socialism in the 1920s and 30s in the North, The story of Madame Despard, the sister of Field Marshal Sir John French, the militaristic viceroy who was there during the Black and Tan regime, but who was not just a feminist and a suffragist, but an Irish Republican, and spends her last days at Whitehead in County Antrim in a house called Need Nagiha, trying to create bonds of affection between Protestant and Catholic workers. So much of this is work in progress rather than the full story.
Éamon, if I could take the opportunity to paraphrase Queen Elizabeth when she was in Dublin Castle, speaking to the topic of commemoration. and speaking to history, Irish history, she said some things would have been better had they been done differently, and other things had they not been done at all. And in terms of the handling thus far of the decade of centenaries, I wonder if you have any thoughts about perhaps things that might have been done differently with commemoration, some missteps perhaps. Of course, in January this year, there was a big political controversy over plans to commemorate the RIC.
Well, certainly Queen Elizabeth's words in Dublin Castle a decade ago were critical. I mean, they unlocked a lot of possibilities about the decade, you know. People wondered, would she apologise for the famine and the Black and Tans? That was never going to happen. But she did talk about some things could have been done better and some things perhaps should not have been done at all. And I think that speaks to the heart, from the heart to the heart, of both traditions really on the island. I mean, I think the key thing is that some things should be remembered by a state act, which in the south involved the Easter Rising, you know, or the transfer of Dublin Castle, which is pending next January from the British state to Michael Collins on the 16th of January 1922. That's going to be remembered as a symbolic act, you know, in the birth of a new Irish state. Some things, though, are better marked by conferences, you know, by perhaps dramas, by exhibitions. I mean, not everything has to be marked by a state act. The problem, I think, with the RIC was it played a key role in Irish life. It was a mainly Catholic force. Most of its officers were in favour of home rule. Some actually left when the Black and Tans were introduced and became active in the Republican movement. But of course, they were, if you like, a paramilitary force, and they maintained British rule in Ireland. So the RIC story became complicated when the Black and Tans were introduced in the 1920s as auxiliaries to the RIC, you know, and suddenly they become part of the RIC as well. And of course, the RIC had suppressed the Fenian Rising of 1867. So again, I mean, some of us would have felt that something should have been a good exhibition. It's going to be very difficult in a state which has had a civil war in the last 100 years, not quite a century ago, about, you know, the nature of independence and about crown and empire, and has had a war of independence in which atrocities were committed on both sides, you know, to take any element of that and actually celebrate them. I think, you know, looking back, a more nuanced approach is better in cases like that. I mean, in the next couple of years, people are going to remember, for example, the McMahon murders in Belfast, an eminent Catholic family wiped out in a situation where there's strong evidence of police collusion, for example. But then they're also going to remember the sectarian assassinations of a group of Protestants at Altnevay in South Armagh, involving the 4th Northern Division of the IRA. These events are very difficult even today. Yet, you know, I've been to South Armagh and dealt with the Altnevay community and talked about these events. And I've talked about the McMahon murders at the Féile event in North Belfast. And I think we have to seek the truth in all these cases. We have to turn up the evidence. We have to look at the broader picture. We have to look at some of these horrendous events, because many shocking events occurred during the so-called Belfast pogroms, or as Nationalists would call them, or the Belfast disturbances, to use the official speech of the early 1920s. And a lot of evidence has come to light. A lot of files that were being withheld about the Special Powers Act, about internment, have now been released. And historians are in a better position, if you like, to paint the wider canvas and to shed light in dark places. And that's in the process of being done. There's a lot more work to be done. But I think we mustn't shy away from the facts, you know. We must, expose the facts and be damned.
Well, Éamon Phoenix, it's been an absolute pleasure. It's been a fantastic talk, fantastic presentation. So on behalf of Féile and Phobail, in partnership with St Mary's University College and the Irish News, I'd like to thank you very much.
Thanks very much indeed, Colin.